There are stories in the Bible that we read with a heavy heart, and this is one of them. The story of Dinah, hidden in the middle of famous chapters, is one of those that seems to have been written to poke at us even today. Don't be fooled. This goes far beyond an ancient drama. What happens between Dinah, Jacob, Simeon, Levi, Shechem, and Hamor touches directly on themes that remain alive in our daily lives: honor, justice, abuse, silence, violence, impulsiveness, and the cost of poorly calculated decisions. This type of video is more than just a Bible history lesson. It's a mirror. It reveals how, even thousands of years ago, humans were already facing moral dilemmas similar to our own. Dinah represents all the silenced voices, and her pain still echoes in the stories of many women who face injustice today. Her brother's actions show the danger of confusing justice with revenge. And Jacob's posture teaches us about prudence, the weight of choices, and the spiritual consequences that echo through generations. So why watch this video? Because it provokes, it teaches, it reveals. It shows that the Bible is not just an old book, it's a living map of the human soul. By learning this story, you not only dive into a forgotten chapter of the Old Testament, but also gain tools to reflect on your own decisions, what is truly just, and what needs to be transformed within us. This is the kind of content that awakens awareness. And let's agree, we really need that today. The story of Dinah, daughter of Jacob and Leah, doesn't start with much fanfare. But the silence with which she appears in the pages of the Old Testament is already a warning. While her brothers, the future patriarchs of the tribes of Israel, get entire chapters in the Bible, Dinah appears suddenly, involved in an episode that feels more like an open wound in the fabric of the sacred narrative. And what a wound! A meeting with Shechem, son of Hamor, turns what could have been a simple social visit into a trigger for one of the most violent massacres recorded in Genesis. There's no ignoring the growing tension in this biblical story. Shechem, a prince accustomed to power, acts without considering the consequences. What happens to Dinah, between dishonor and desire, in a relationship that raises more questions than answers, triggers the fury of Simeon and Levi. These two brothers, shaped by a rigid sense of family honor, interpret the act as an intolerable outrage. And this is where a blood pact is born, fueled by suffering and the desire for revenge. This narrative is not just about a mistake made. It's about the response to the mistake, about how the pain of a woman reverberates in violent actions. Simeon and Levi didn't just feel betrayed. They felt that the entire structure of honor that upheld Jacob's patriarchy was about to crumble. It was as if, in their minds, allowing dishonor to go unpunished would be accepting the collapse of their tribe's identity. And for them, that was inconceivable. In real life, how often do we see impulsive decisions being made under the weight of shame or humiliation? We're not just talking about the Bible. We're talking about our neighborhoods, the news, family situations we've seen or experienced. What do we do when something unjust happens to someone we love? How do we differentiate justice from revenge? Here, the story of Dinah becomes a mirror, and it begins to show us that when emotion becomes the guide, prudence abandons ship. The massacre that follows didn't come out of nowhere. It came from a slow buildup of pain, wounded honor, and a society shaped to react with blood to any sign of disrespect. And look, what comes after this moment is even more impactful, because the plan to restore that honor involves a move that few would have seen coming. In Dinah's time, the world revolved around a very specific axis, that of family honor. In a society shaped by patriarchy, where a man's name was the pillar of his existence, a woman's conduct reflected directly on the reputation of the entire household. The Bible, in narrating this episode in Genesis, makes it clear that any misstep by a woman was a social earthquake. A woman's chastity was not just hers, it was a collective good. And that's why Dinah's encounter with Shechem caused such an uproar. Even today, we see remnants of this way of thinking. In many cultures, a family's reputation is still placed on the shoulders of women, as if they were the moral seal of an entire clan. That's heavy, right? And back then, even more so. A young woman going out unaccompanied, as Dinah did when visiting the daughters of the land, was already seen as a calculated risk. She wasn't just Dinah, daughter of Jacob. She was the reflection of Leah's lineage and the promise made to Abraham. The problem intensifies when we understand that the relationship between Dinah and Shechem, whether forced or not, was not a simple encounter. It was an event interpreted as dishonor, an attack on the moral fabric of the tribes of Israel. And dishonor in that social structure wasn't washed away with words. It was washed away with blood. A slip-up was like spilling ink on a white linen tunic. No matter the size of the stain, it consumed the entire image. At first glance, it's easy to judge the characters in this story. But when we look more deeply, we see a people trying to survive, maintaining their identity in a sea of different cultures. Shechem and Hamor, no matter how powerful they were, did not fully understand the spiritual value the Hebrews placed on their lineage. It wasn't just pride, it was a covenant with God. And this covenant could not be tainted by actions that, in the eyes of the Israelites, violated the precepts of divine justice. Behind Dinah's pain, there was also the weight of an era where the feminine was silenced, protected, and at the same time held responsible. The violence, suffering, and silence she endured speak of thousands of women throughout biblical history, women whose voices only echo when something explodes. And it is precisely in this silence, mixed with the growing anger of the brothers, that a plan is born. A clever plan, seemingly innocent, but with a hidden objective. When Simeon and Levi heard what had happened to Dinah, blood boiled, and not just from anger, it was from urgency. They knew that in a society where honor was everything, their sister's dishonor demanded a response. But instead of resorting to violence immediately, they opted for strategy. No swords at first. They proposed an agreement that, at first glance, seemed like a gesture of peace, circumcision for all the men of Shechem. The proposal caught Hamor and Shechem off guard. After all, they were willing to do anything to keep Dinah with them. And this is where the cold genius of the plan comes in. Circumcision for the Hebrews was a symbol of covenant with God. For the Shechemites, it became a trap. They accepted it without realizing that, in the days following the procedure, they would be weak, vulnerable, without the strength to defend themselves. And so the field was set for what was to come. It's interesting to note how the brothers' plan was not just a military maneuver. It was a cultural manipulation. They used a sacred symbol as a weapon. It shows how, when driven by revenge, even what was holy can be distorted. And this is a powerful lesson. How many times do people, because of emotional wounds, manipulate even good intentions to cause harm? This happens in relationships, in business, in politics, and it always begins with something that seems right. This kind of disguised deceit is more common than we realize. You know when someone says, "No, it's fine, I understand," but inside they are plotting an emotional bomb. That's what happened. Simeon and Levi smiled, nodded, shook hands, while preparing the raid, the massacre, the destruction. The blood pact was sealed there with gentle words and burning intent. And the city of Shechem was about to learn that not every covenant is made in good faith. What's curious is that the plan worked. And this raises an uncomfortable question. When a strategy works, even if it's cruel, does it justify itself? Perhaps you found yourself in situations where you had to choose between what was effective and what was ethical. And here lies the great dilemma of this biblical story. Because the massacre didn't happen by accident, it was calculated, orchestrated, and brutal. 3 days after the collective circumcision, the men of Shechem were in pure suffering. Imagine an entire city of warriors weakened, writhing in pain, while they believed they had taken a step of faith toward unity with the tribes of Israel. It was precisely at this moment that Simeon and Levi decided to act. With swords in hand and no mercy in their eyes, they invaded the city. Revenge took form, raw, violent, and final. Shechem and Hamor were killed without a chance to defend themselves. What began as an offer of alliance turned into a bloodbath. And the massacre didn't stop with the leaders. All the men of the city were struck down, no distinctions. It was honor being washed not only with blood, but with ancestral fury, as if Dinah's pain had echoed in the brothers' blades. But it didn't stop there. The women and children, now orphaned and captive, were taken by the tribes of Israel. The plunder was total. Goods, animals, everything of value was taken. What was once a prosperous city turned into a scene of devastation. This was no longer just an emotional response. It was a complete reconfiguration of power. A city was wiped off the map because of the wrath of two men. Here, the Bible invites us to pause, not to judge, but to reflect. How many times, in trying to seek justice with our own hands, do we end up crossing the line? In their attempt to restore honor, Simeon and Levi went beyond the limits of prudence, diving into the territory of wounded pride and justice done by force. At this point, violence was no longer just a response. It had become an identity. It was what shaped the narrative. And this identity, marked by blood and plunder, would place not only the two brothers in the center of the tension, but all of Jacob's family. The destroyed city was just the beginning. The spiritual, emotional, and political weight of that act would soon begin to be felt. And Jacob, upon learning what his sons had done, would have a reaction that surprises and also reveals the deep dilemmas of a father, a leader, and a man chosen by God. When Jacob learned about the massacre in Shechem, his heart weighed like a stone in his chest. Contrary to what many might have expected, he didn't celebrate the vengeance. The pain of seeing his daughter Dinah wounded was already immense. But now he had to deal with the extreme violence carried out by Simeon and Levi. Jacob's reaction was initially silent, but charged with tension that hung in the air like a storm about to break. He knew the massacre would not go unpunished, not in front of the other tribes and peoples around. That attitude, although based on defending honor, put the entire future of the tribes of Israel at risk. After all, an attack of that magnitude could be interpreted as a declaration of war. And Jacob, who carried God's promise, needed to act with prudence, something his sons had disregarded. The text in Genesis shows Jacob afraid. Yes, afraid. It wasn't just a political retaliation. It was the fear of having compromised the divine mission because of the violence. Divine justice does not walk hand in hand with bloodshed driven by impulse. Jacob understood that his sons had not just reacted, they had plotted destruction. And now, the weight of this fell on his shoulders. This is where a deep moral reflection comes in. How many times do leaders, fathers, authority figures find themselves at this crossroads between love for family and the need to correct the mistakes made by it? Jacob loved Simeon and Levi, but he knew he couldn't protect what was indefensible. He couldn't remain silent in the face of violence that now had a name, a body, and consequences. He would need one day to make that clear, and that day would come on his deathbed. But before that, Jacob carried the weight of his son's imprudence and saw how a blood pact could shake even the most spiritual foundations of his lineage. What he would do next, and how he would mark Simeon and Levi forever, would become a turning point in biblical history and in the inheritances of the tribes of Israel. Time passed, but Jacob did not forget what Simeon and Levi had done. When his final hour came and he gathered his sons to bless them, a symbolic and sacred moment, he made a difficult decision. Instead of words of honor, he pronounced a curse. The swords that had wounded Shechem now cut the destiny of the tribes. The curse came as a delayed echo of divine justice, heavy and intentional. Jacob said that Simeon and Levi would be scattered among the brothers. This was much more than geography. It was shattered identity. While other tribes would receive land and structure, they would live dispersed, without a consolidated territorial inheritance. For those living in a culture where land was synonymous with blessing and stability, this was a harsh blow. And although Levi would become the priestly tribe, the weight of the massacre would never leave them. It's like when someone breaks the trust of a community. The person may even be forgiven, may even redeem themselves. But there are things that change forever. The dispersion of the tribes of Simeon and Levi was the spiritual and social consequence of an ill-considered act. It was like an echo of that blood pact, still reverberating through generations. The Bible, with its subtle clarity, shows us that divine justice does not fail, even if it takes time. This part of the biblical story is like a mirror for real life. Sometimes we plant something and only reap the consequences years later. Sometimes what seemed like a victory at the moment turns out to be a burden, and the dispersion of the tribes is one of those lessons hidden in Genesis. Jacob's curse wasn't out of hatred, it was out of awareness. He knew he couldn't allow violence to become a legacy. Even in the midst of pain, loss, and open wounds, there is something that begins to insinuate itself in the story's subtext: the possibility of redemption. Because if there's one thing the Bible teaches us, and that Jacob, despite all his pain, carried in his heart, it is that God never closes the story in the middle, and there's a powerful spiritual lesson that still needs to be revealed. The story of Dinah, though shrouded in violence, dishonor, and massacre, is also a window into the deeper layers of divine justice. Unlike the justice of men, which often acts with haste, fury, or convenience, God's justice moves with purpose. Jacob understood this. Not by chance, even wounded by suffering and disappointed by Simeon and Levi, he sought an answer in something greater. Revenge had brought destruction, but it had not brought peace. This moral lesson still echoes today. Does solving things with shouting, force, or revenge really work? Or does it only leave scars on those who live and those who watch? It's interesting to note that redemption, so often mentioned in the Bible, often arises in moments when humans find themselves powerless in the face of consequences. Dinah, silent, represents all the voices suffocated by the logic of patriarchy. But even in silence, her pain shaped the history of a nation. Jacob's prudence in not glorifying what his sons had done reveals a heart aligned with eternal values. He knew that true victory doesn't come from the sword, but from forgiveness, repentance, and restoration. And here's a powerful key. Peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of purpose. And purpose is not achieved through plunder, violence, or manipulation, but with faith and moral courage. Want a practical example? Think about your own relationships. Every time you choose compassion over impulsive reaction, you are walking in the direction of divine justice. When you avoid gossip, emotional revenge, or sharp responses, you are acting like Jacob. And this, in a world so full of emotional wars, is revolutionary. It may seem small, but it has the power to change families, businesses, and even generations. Looking at this entire biblical story, Dinah's pain, Shechem's mistake, Simeon and Levi's fury, and Jacob's prudence, an undeniable truth emerges. Even the darkest mistakes can teach. Spiritual consequences are not merely punishments. They are invitations to reflection, change, and redemption. And maybe that's why this story, so hidden, has crossed the centuries and still speaks with such strength. Now that you've encountered this powerful and little explored biblical story, tell me, how many times have you made decisions driven by anger or impulse, thinking you were administering justice with your own hands? And how many times did you forget that even the most right actions can have heavy spiritual consequences? Dinah's story, with all the pain and lessons it carries, invites us to reflect on this, on prudence, on balance, and on the true meaning of redemption. This story isn't just to be heard and forgotten. It's meant to be felt, questioned, applied. What will you do now with this knowledge? Will you continue reacting without thinking, or will you start practicing true justice, the kind that transforms and doesn't destroy? How many conflicts in your life could be avoided with wisdom, with pause, with listening? Think about that with care. Lord, give us a wise and patient heart, that in the face of injustice we may be instruments of your justice and not of our wrath. Teach us to pause before acting, to listen before judging, and to love even when the pain is great. May every decision we make reflect your grace, and may we be above all builders of peace. Amen. If this message touched your heart, made you rethink your actions, and ignited something new within you, then my gratitude for being together on this journey is immense. Thank you for walking with me through this reflection. Your presence here matters a lot. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take the opportunity now. Turn on notifications, because we still have a lot of content that inspires, teaches, and transforms. And you deserve every bit of this journey of wisdom and faith.